Fall 2018 term of the Washington History Seminar. My name is Eric Arneson from George Washington University. I'm the co-chair of this seminar, and it is a pleasure to welcome back and to the other co-chair's seat my colleague Christian Osterman, who has returned from a very well-deserved sabbatical, productive sabbatical in Germany, where he was working on a long-term biographical project. As some of you know, and some of you perhaps don't, the Washington History Seminar is a collaborative project that brings together the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the History and Public Policy program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today is a Wednesday. Next week we meet on a Tuesday, but normally, traditionally, we meet on Mondays from 4 to 5:30 p.m. So keep that one in mind. If you have not yet picked up or seen the lineup for this fall, you can find it outside these doors here on the back. There is a listing of this season's sessions, and you can also find the listings on the websites of the Wilson Center and the National History Center. I think our programming this term is particularly exciting. It's also a pleasure to launch this seminar this season with the annual William Roger Lewis Lecture. Professor Lewis is the Kerr Chair in English History and Culture at the University of Texas, Austin. He is a former president of the National History Center and the American Historical Association, and he was the founder and driving force behind this seminar for many years. So we are honored that Roger is with us today, as he is many Monday afternoons, coming up, commuting really from Texas. We're delighted that you're here, and we are delighted to offer this seminar in your honor. He is currently, thank you. He is a mainstay here at the Wilson Center as a global fellow, so you will see him in this halls. Seminars like this don't come off just by themselves. On the logistics front, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Amanda Perry of the National History Center are the behind-the-scenes folks who work on planning and logistics to ensure that these come off without a hitch. We also rely on the financial support of a number of institutions, in particular the Department of History of George Washington University and a number of anonymous donors. And as I never tire of saying, we hope you will join their ranks in the near future. And one last piece of business before we begin. Undoubtedly, many of you will have one of these devices in your pocket, in your bag, somewhere on your person. If you would put it on silent, we'd very much appreciate it. They just tend to go off at exactly the wrong moment every time. So, with business out of the way, I will turn this over to Christian Osterman, my co-chair, who will introduce today's speaker.
Very briefly, thank you, Eric. Great to be back after some wonderful months at the American Academy in Berlin. But it's good to be back. It's particularly good to be back for the William Roger Lewis Lecture. Let me just echo what Eric said about Roger's pivotal role in getting this seminar off the ground, 9 years ago, almost a decade ago. And he has, of course, been a steadfast and crucial supporter ever since, as he remains affiliated with the Wilson Center as a global fellow. Let me say thank you to Philippa Strum, who may not be here today, but who co-chaired the seminar on behalf of the Wilson Center during my leave. And also thank Eric for holding down the fort while I was writing in Berlin, writing a biography of Marcus Wolf, and that of course connects with today's subject because Wolf is often seen, and like himself, seen as a model for the Carla and John le Carré's novels. Which brings me to today's distinguished speaker, Adam Sisman. He's the author of Boswell's Presumptuous Task, winner of the U.S. National Books Critics Circle Award for Biography, and renowned biographer of John le Carré, as well as historians A.G.P. Taylor and Hugh Trevor-Roper. He has edited Trevor-Roper's letters. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and an honorary fellow of the University of St. Andrews. And we're extremely excited and honored to have him here today with a lecture on the anti-American politics of John le Carré.
Thank you. Before I begin to talk about that subject, I too would like to just say a brief word about Roger Lewis, or William Roger Lewis as he is known formally. It would be presumptuous of me to try and summarize Roger's very distinguished career as a historian, but I will say that he is at least as much respected on my side of the Atlantic as he is here. I just want to say a personal tribute. I first met Roger when I was more than 25 years ago, when I was writing my first book on A.J.P. Taylor. Some of you may or may not know that Roger did postgraduate work in Oxford under A.J.P. Taylor supervision. I was then a complete unknown. I had not published anything, and I had no claim on his time. But Roger was extraordinarily kind to me and took time to help me. When I'd written my book, he read the manuscript and sent me such a generous letter that I can recall it almost word for word. Gave me a glow of pleasure. And ever since then, he has been enormously supportive and encouraging. And I know I'm not the only one to whom he has been so generous. More generally, he has been my host at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, where he has welcomed a variety of guests to his British Studies seminar, academics, journalists, public servants of various kinds, and nobodies like me. And he, one of the things that I know that we value in Britain is the cultural exchange between the two countries, which Roger has enabled. And I know of a number of others who appreciate him as much as I do. So I'd just like to say thank you, Roger. Thank you. Right.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Could we just double check the microphones, make sure they're on?
Yes.
Can you all hear
Can you
us
hear
all
me
the
at the
way in
back? Yes, good point.
We can all hear, but we can't see.
Well, that's just as well. So, the anti-American politics of John le Carré. It is a truism that as they get older, angry young radicals tend to relax into complacent conservatism. The fire of youth fades into a dull glow or is snuffed out altogether. The injustice that once seemed so offensive becomes more bearable, perhaps ameliorated by the rewards of success. But John le Carré has traveled in the opposite direction. As he has aged and become prosperous, he has become more angry, not less. Far from dimming in his ninth decade, the flame of his rage burns hot and strong. I've become more radical in old age than I've ever been, le Carré told an interviewer recently. Now nearly 87 years old, the angry old man shows little sign of calming down. This change is manifest in his books, whereas ambivalence was the dominant mood of le Carré's Cold War novels. His more recent ones are uncompromisingly partisan. George Smiley, le Carré's most famous character, is no Cold War warrior. Far from relishing the struggle against the East, he is repeatedly troubled by doubt, agonizing about whether the anti-communist cause justifies the concomitant human suffering. Even in his moment of triumph, when his arch-enemy, the Soviet spymaster Karla, is on the brink of surrender, Smiley feels pity for him. He wants him to go back into the East. In his moment of triumph, when his feels pity for him. What distinguishes Smiley from Karla is not ideology, but moderation. In Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Smiley tells his lieutenant, Peter Gwilym, that Karla's fanaticism will prove his downfall. Yet in fact, it is human weakness, his love for his daughter, that brings about Karla's eventual capitulation. And this goes to the moral heart of le Carré's fiction. The tension within them is not between left and right, but between the individual and the cause, between people and patriotism. When he began writing fiction in the late 1950s, John le Carré, whose real name is David Cornwall, was an intelligence officer in the UK Security Service. MI5's principal function in those days was to resist communist penetration and subversion of the British state. Le Carré drew directly on his MI5 work for the storyline of his first novel, Call for the Dead, published under a pseudonym to protect his identity. One of Cornwall's tasks at MI5, at which he apparently excelled, was to vet individuals to ensure that they posed no security risk. In the opening chapter of Call for the Dead, George Smiley is introduced as a senior intelligence officer who has just been vetting a civil servant with access to sensitive information. In America, a witch hunt against communists had meant that those with a communist background were banned from working in Hollywood, let alone government. But Smiley is shown as untroubled about his interviewee's communist past. Half the cabinet were in the party in the 1930s, he remarks. By the time Call for the Dead was published in 1961, Cornwall had transferred to the Secret Intelligence Service, more popularly known as MI6, and was serving undercover in Bonn, then the capital of the Federal Republic of West Germany. His third novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, made him famous around the world. It occupied the top of the US bestseller list for 35 weeks, becoming the best-selling novel of 1964. The intense press interest led to his cover being blown and to his resignation from the Secret Service. One reason why The Spy Who Came In From the Cold made such an enormous impact was its seeming authenticity. This apparently was the real world of spying, one in which there were no heroes and the line between right and wrong was at best blurred. The protagonist, Alec Lemus, is not a glamorous figure. He is a tired middle-aged man on the edge of burnout. Lemus's outburst at the end of the book is a fervent protest against the bad things he has been asked to do in the service of his country. "What the hell do you think spies are?" he asks his distressed girlfriend. "Moral philosophers measuring everything they do against the word of God or Karl Marx? They're not. They're just a bunch of seedy, squalid bastards like me. Little men, drunkards, queers, henpecked husbands, civil servants playing cowboys and Indians to brighten their rotten little lives." This was a very different depiction of spying from the one presented in Ian Fleming's novels. The moral ambiguities of The Spy Who Came From the Cold are in marked contrast to the unquestioning certainties of the James Bond books, in which the good guys and the bad guys are clearly delineated. To readers in the early 1960s, accustomed to the messy compromises of the Cold War, they seemed far more truthful. Le Carré's squalid settings seem more realistic than the glamorous five-star hotels, high-rolling casinos, and expensive restaurants frequented by James Bond. As it turns out, Lemus has been deceived by his own masters. In reality, he's a mere instrument for what he eventually realizes is a filthy, lousy operation to divert attention away from Mundt, a highly placed British agent in the East German security apparatus, at the expense of his rival Fiedler, a much more sympathetic character. To save him, as Lemus bitterly explains, from a clever little Jew in his own department who had begun to suspect the truth. Two innocent people are sacrificed to protect Mundt's cover. The fact that both of them are Jews and Mundt a former Nazi makes an ugly operation hideous. Lemus's boss, the feline spy master known as Control, head of the organization known simply as the Circus, is unabashed in admitting that the methods used by both sides in the Cold War have become much the same. "I mean," he muses aloud to Lemus, "you can't be less ruthless than the opposition simply because your government's policy is benevolent, can you now?" The Spy Who Came In From the Cold presents British intelligence as no better than the enemy, and in some ways worse. There's right and wrong on both sides. Lemus and Fiedler alike are flawed individuals struggling to preserve their humanity in a conflict without honor or principle. There are no American characters in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or in any of Le Carré's other novels of the 1960s. But a whiff of anti-American feeling becomes noticeable in his work from the mid-1970s onwards. Knee-jerk anti-Americanism was latent in Englishmen of his generation, many of whom found it difficult not to resent the steep decline in British power after the Second World War and the simultaneous ascent of America. resentment of American hegemony persisted long after it had become obvious that Britain was no longer America's equal. Indeed, one might say that until comparatively recently, anti-Americanism was, in a mild way, endemic in Britain. It was so ingrained that I confess I barely noticed it myself until I married an American in 1979 and became embarrassed by the ignorance and prejudice displayed by some of my unthinking compatriots. As a young man, David Cornwell seems to have been fairly conservative in his opinions and almost absurdly patriotic. Perhaps to compensate for his father's dereliction of duty, Cornwell showed a Boy Scout willingness to serve his country. While an undergraduate at Oxford in the early 1950s, he had expressed anti-American sentiments, apparently reacting passionately to the execution of the Rosenbergs. But these and other similar remarks were addressed to a fellow student, a member of the Communist Party, on whom he was secretly spying for MI5. Some years ago, I was present at a colloquium at Princeton on British historians of the 20th century, and during the course of the discussion, the subject of anti-Americanism arose. One of the professors present suggested that the definitive expression of anti-Americanism in English culture could be found in John le Carré's 1974 novel, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, in which one of his characters states openly that, quotes, he hates America very deeply. This observation, that the definitive statement of anti-Americanism could be found in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, was not directed at me, because I'd only recently met David Cornwell, and few people then knew that I was writing his biography. But I nevertheless responded, making the point in his defense that this anti-American sentiment is undercut by being voiced by the traitor, Bill Hayden. He is addressing Smiley in a confession after his treachery has been unmasked at the end of the story, and his words are depicted as empty rhetoric. This illustrates perhaps the need for caution in labeling le Carré as anti-American. And in one sense, he is nothing of the kind. He has enjoyed enormous success in America, where he has been feted and richly rewarded. He has often visited America and has long-standing friendships with Americans. While writing my book, for example, I stayed with a couple in Los Angeles, whom he has known for more than half a century. He has enjoyed love affairs with at least 2 American women. One of his sons is married to an American, the daughter of his old friend David Greenway. Another makes his life in California. The anti-Americanism detectable in his work seems to have developed in response to international politics, and more recently to have been linked to a wider radicalization of his views. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was the first volume of a trilogy of linked novels exploring the struggle between Smiley and Carla. It was followed by The Honourable Schoolboy, in which much of the action takes place in Southeast Asia. During his research for the book, Cornwell travelled extensively in the region, only months before Western-backed regimes in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos collapsed in a heap of dominoes. Cornwell became critical of what he saw as American interference in the region. In Saigon, he reread Graham Greene's The Quiet American, which drew on Greene's experiences in French Indochina as a war correspondent in the early 1950s. As Graham Greene had done a generation before, Cornwell blamed American meddling for the developing disasters. In his notebook, he poured out his loathing of the CIA men he had encountered. I'm quoting here from his notebook. I hate them more than I hate myself, more than I hate a hangover. They're the one bunch I hate morally. I only have to see their Mormon haircuts and listen to their open-plan charm. I only have to hear them call Europe, Europe, and I start sweating at the joints. While staying in a Bangkok hotel, he expressed his disgust at being served one of those ghastly American sandwiches full of wooden spikes. As the Anglo-Dutch writer Ian Baruma argued, reviewing my book in The Nation, such remarks go beyond mere political dislike. It is cultural. Baruma went on to make a further point. Le Carré's sense of anger and frustration stems from the official American claim of a higher morality. So much of US foreign policy, then and now, has been cloaked in the language of freedom and democracy, even when it involved raw aggression. To Le Carré, this hypocrisy is what makes it even more odious than the actions of openly criminal regimes. The Honourable Schoolboy, published in 1977, was the first of several novels exploring the unequal relationship between the circus and its American cousins, with their much greater resources and longer reach. American bullishness, naivety, and eagerness to please are contrasted with British cynicism and world weariness. The Americans rely on technology, the British on experience. In the Honourable Schoolboy's dramatic conclusion, Smiley's prize is snatched away from him in an American helicopter. Both Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and the concluding volume in the Quest for Carla trilogy, Smiley's People, published in 1979, were adapted for the BBC for a very successful television series in which Alec Guinness played George Smiley. David Cornwell made a personal approach to Guinness to ask him to take the part, and the two formed a lasting friendship. After Smiley's People, le Carré set off in a new direction, leaving the circus behind to focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict and The Little Drummer Girl, published in 1983, a novel about a young English woman with left-wing sympathies who is recruited by Israeli intelligence to entrap a Palestinian terrorist. Americans do not feature at all in The Little Drummer Girl, which perhaps paradoxically became his most successful book in the USA, with what was then the largest first printing ever undertaken by his publishers, Alfred A. Knopf. A Perfect Spy, published in 1986, widely perceived as le Carré's most autobiographical novel, returned to familiar territory. Magnus Pym, the narrator, is a double agent, a British intelligence officer who has been recruited by the Czechs. Halfway through the book is a scene in which a high-level team of American spooks voice their suspicions of Pym to their British equivalents. The episode is told from the point of view of Grant Lederer III, a CIA man who is both friend and enemy to Pym. Lederer is a geeky, insecure person who wants desperately to be liked by Pym and by Pym's boss, Jack Brotherhood, but they keep him at arm's length. In response to a complaint from Bob Gottlieb, le Carré's long-standing editor at Knopf, that Lederer read like a parody American, Cornwell replied, "You don't meet the ones I meet." The charge of anti-Americanism surfaced again in criticism of the Russia House, published in 1989. The Irish writer Conor Cruise O'Brien praised the book as vintage le Carré, but thought it marred by an anti-American bias. As he rightly pointed out, much of the story hinges on the fraught relationship between the British and American intelligence communities. Early on in the story, the narrator, Harry Palfrey, establishes the Britons' view of their domineering cousins. The Americans think of themselves as the larger beneficiaries, the majority shareholders. The Americans throw their weight around in a manner distressing to British sensibilities. It seems to me, though, that this portrayal of the special relationship is not necessarily anti-American, but merely realistic. In the Russia House, le Carré's unflattering picture of some American behavior is balanced by his recognition of British banality. Americans, reflect Palfrey, lack the instinct to dissemble that comes so naturally to we British. As Conor Cruise O'Brien observed, the only character in the novel who is consistently presented as despicable in everything he says and does is Clive, a senior figure in British intelligence, who is entirely in the pockets of whichever American intelligence faction appears to be on top. In fact, the moral heart of the book lies elsewhere. Barley Blair, the novel's protagonist, is faced with a choice, whether to betray his country and thereby save the woman whom he loves, or to remain loyal and lose her. For him, the answer is obvious: real people in exchange for unreal arguments. I'm quoting here from Barley's internal monologue. As to his loyalty to his country, Barley saw it only as a question of which England he chose to serve. His last ties to the imperial family were dead. The chauvinist drumbeat revolted him. He would rather be trampled by it than march with it. He knew a better England by far, and it was inside himself. Le Carré's sympathy for ordinary Russians was obvious in the Russia House, but he never had any truck with communism, as was evident in his reaction to its collapse. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in this process was the fall of the Berlin Wall. After weeks of mass unrest in East Germany, it became obvious that the authorities were no longer willing to authorize the use of force to prevent people crossing into West Berlin. The vastly outnumbered soldiers started to open the frontier checkpoints to allow free movement back and forth. Demonstrators began to climb the wall and to take chunks out of it with sledgehammers. The unnatural division of a city and of a people was ending. It was a symbolic moment. Within a year, Germany would be reunified. Across Europe, there were celebrations as a succession of uprisings brought down hated regimes. The Cold War was over. Like millions of others, Cornwall watched the unfolding events on television. Less coherent than usual, he wrote happily to Alec Guinness, "If life and politics ever give a chance to celebrate, which they don't, we really should, because for all our faults, we were right, and for all their proclaimed ideals, they were a bunch of corrupt, foul-minded piglets," which is a calumny against piglets. So please read swine. It was often said that le Carré lost his subject when the Cold War ended. Friends stopped him in the street to commiserate. "Whatever are you going to write now?" they would ask. No matter how often or how emphatically he rejected the idea that the destruction of the Berlin Wall meant the death of the spy novel, the impression persisted. In 1994, a cartoon by Jeff Danziger in the Christian Science Monitor showed Cornwall bowing his head to his maker in grateful thanks at the revelation that Aldrich Ames, the CIA counterintelligence officer, had been supplying secrets to the Russians. Cornwall has a framed copy of this cartoon on the wall of his office. To some extent, Cornwall was a victim of his own success. For most people, the name John le Carré was synonymous with the Cold War. More than any other writer of his generation, he had shaped the public perception of the struggle between East and West. "I saw the Berlin Wall go up when I was 30, and I saw it come down when I was 60, he told an interviewer from The Guardian. "I was chronicling my time from a position of knowledge and sympathy. I lived the passion of my time, and if people tell me I'm a genre writer, I can only reply that spying was the genre of the Cold War." George Smiley made what seemed to be his last bow in The Secret Pilgrim, published in 1991, a collection of stories apparently told by the retired master spy as he looked back over his long career. In fact, he makes a fleeting reappearance in le Carré's most recent novel, A Legacy of Spies. Ian Barumer, reviewing The Secret Pilgrim from the New York Review of Books, of which he is now, as I'm sure you know, editor, deplored what he saw as a crude anti-Americanism in le Carré's more recent work and reflected on what le Carré would write in the future, now that the Cold War was apparently over. Cornwall resented the notion that he was finished. He did not relish reading his own obituary. He argued that the spy story had been born long before the birth of the Cold War and would not die with its demise. Spy writers would just have to adapt. He pointed out that at least 3 of his novels had nothing whatsoever to do with the Cold War, and a 4th not much. Communism might have been vanquished, but other enemies remained. There was still plenty of territory left for him to explore. In 1989, he identified Angola, Salvador, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Burma, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Chad, and Libya as just some of the places where spooks, arms dealers, and phony humanitarians were active. His next novel, The Night Manager, would describe an undercover operation by a branch of British intelligence against one such arms dealer, a man contemptuously indifferent to the victims of his trade. As he pointed out, the collapse of communism did not mean the end of the Russian threat. The Russian bear is sick. The bear is bankrupt. The bear is frightened of his past, his present, and his future, he said in a speech delivered in the summer of 1990, as the Soviet Union was already beginning to break up into its constituent parts. But the bear is still armed to the teeth and very, very proud. Le Carré's novels after the end of the Cold War were, if anything, even more relevant to fast-changing political developments around the world. When he delivered the manuscript of his next novel, Our Game, published in 1995, his American publisher asked whether Chechnya was a made-up place. Only months later, the obscure Russian Republic was dominating the international news. The Tailor of Panama, published in 1996, an homage to Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana, dealt with big power manipulation of small states, a perennial topic. The theme of Single and Single, published in 1999, was money laundering by Russian criminals. The Constant Gardener, in 2001, exposed the unscrupulous behavior of Big Pharma in the Third World. It seemed there was still plenty left for le Carré to write about following the collapse of communism. In the foreword to a paperback edition of The Tailor of Panama, issued in 2001, le Carré took the opportunity to attack what was then current American foreign policy, especially the failure to ratify the Kyoto Protocol on climate change. The new American realism, which is nothing other than gross corporate power cloaked in demagogy, means one thing only, that America will put America first in everything, he wrote. Quite simply and emphatically, I do not believe that the United States is fit to run the post-war Cold War world, and I think the sooner Britain and Europe wake up to that fact, the better. Cornwall expressed contempt for the newly elected President of the United States. I happen also to believe that George W. Bush is not fit to run America, or for that matter a single-decker bus, but that's America's business. Unfortunately, he has been given charge of the world's only superpower. Cornwall was scarcely less contemptuous of the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He had been thrilled by Labour's victory in the 1997 general election, which seemed to offer fresh hope after almost 20 years of Conservative rule. But by the time of the next election in June 2001, disillusion had replaced his excitement. In an interview with the playwright David Hare, Cornwall said that he would like to see Blair punished in the coming poll, then only 3 weeks away. Not only had he failed to instigate much-needed reform, he had continued the Thatcherite legacy. He would have privatized air if he could. Worst of all, Blair had kowtowed to the Americans. We don't have a single member of the Blair administration lifting a public finger against the ecological ruin that George W. is promising the United States, he said. He deplored the whimpering echo from Blair when the American president supported the drug companies in their legal action against the South African government, which was trying to distribute free medication to combat HIV infection. I thought Blair was lying when he denied he was a socialist, Cornwall told Hare. The worst thing I can say about him is that he was telling the truth. When Hare suggested that Cornwall's increasing engagement with politics was in the great tradition of writers becoming radicalized in later years, Cornwall responded by citing the German term, Altertzorn, the rage of age. He recognized the danger that he might lose readers if his books became too polemical. Story and character must come first, he said, but I am now so angry that I have to exercise a good deal of restraint in order to produce a readable book. At the core of his next novel would be a man whose radical past has caught up with him in middle age. Cornwall envisaged a naive young Englishman isolated in Berlin at the end of the 1960s, who drifts into revolutionary anarchism. 30 years on, he is living quietly in Munich when he is contacted by his old comrade Sasha, whom he suspects of planning an act of terrorism. While writing The Constant Gardener, Cornwall had attended meetings of anti-corporate groups. He had seen for himself the frustration of the young at what they perceived to be the exploitation of the Third World, wrecking the lives of the powerless. His experiences led him to speculate that this anger might be breeding a new generation of young terrorists, rather as an earlier generation of terrorists had emerged from the radical left in the 1960s and 70s. Cornwall himself had witnessed violent student demonstrations in Paris in 1968. Investigating what had become of the 1960s firebrands, Cornwall found that many of them were now respectable citizens. A paediatrician neighbour of his in Hampstead, for example, or Lothar Menn, once a comrade of Angela Davis and Tariq Ali, now one of the pinnacles of his German publishers, Ullstein. Some were still active, like the campaigning journalist John Pilger. Timothy Garton-Ash put Cornwall in touch with Anthony Barnett, a former member of the committee of the New Left Review, who had spent some time in the late 1960s living in a Berlin commune. In constructing the central character for Absolute Friends, Ted Mundy, Cornwall awarded him elements of his own past. Like Cornwall, Mundy has a loving father and an absent mother. Like Cornwall, he has fallen in love with the German muse. Like Cornwall, he has acted in a schoolboy production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Like Cornwall, he has attended a boarding school in the West Country. And like Cornwall too, he has become involved in spying, so that he no longer knows which parts of him are pretending. The novel opens with a reunion between Mundy and Sasha, whom he has known since 1969 when they had shared a squalid room in Berlin. Years later, Sasha, by this time an officer in the Stasi, offers to become a double agent. Though not a professional, Mundy becomes his case officer. Their loyalty to each other overrides their loyalty to family or country, just as their friendship transcends the division between East and West, between England and Germany. It is reminiscent of the central relationship between Magnus and Axel in A Perfect Spy. Sasha is a version of Axel. "You are my absolute friend," declares Sasha. The contradictions involved in running a double agent allowed Cornwall to explore notions of duality, as he had done in A Perfect Spy. Let's all pretend to be someone else, Mundy reflects as he is being followed in Prague, and then perhaps we'll find out who we are. By the 11th of September 2001, Cornwall had written the first 2 chapters. That day, he and his wife Jane were in Hamburg, They had spent the morning watching archive footage of Rudi Dutschke, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, and other 1960s radicals, and were back at their hotel relaxing in the bar when they received an urgent message from Cornwall's secretary to find a television. They rushed up to their room and switched on the set, in time to see the second plane fly into the Twin Towers. In the next few hours, Cornwall made impotent efforts to contact his son Stephen, who lived in California with his English wife and their 8 children. Like so many other people around the world, he felt an enormous, inexpressible sympathy for the victims, for America as a whole at that moment. As for his book, Cornwall's immediate reaction was that it was dead in the water. Even to be contemplating a novel about a terrorist plot at such a time seemed unacceptable. His perspective soon changed, however. After President Bush declared a worldwide war on terror, Cornwall began to feel that his book had a renewed validity. He was horrified when the American government set up a detention camp within the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where prisoners could be held indefinitely without trial, outside US jurisdiction and protection of the Geneva Convention. He deplored the use of extraordinary rendition, the abduction and transfer of a person from one country to another without legal process. Indeed, as the months passed, his mounting outrage at what was being said and done by the leaders of the West added urgency to the novel. He had reluctantly supported the invasion of Afghanistan and favoured attempts to eliminate the leadership of al-Qaeda, but was bitterly opposed to the moves to take action against Iraq, and appalled that so many Americans and so many Britons had been gulled into believing that Saddam Hussein was implicated in the attacks on America. The lies that have been distributed are so many and so persistent, he would say, that arguably fiction is the only way to tell the truth. In September 2002, the Cornwalls joined an anti-war rally in central London. Days earlier, Tony Blair had released a document presenting the case for going to war with Iraq. The marchers, whose numbers were estimated between 150,000 and 400,000, were kettled, that is, pressed tight by the police. Cornwall found the whole experience extremely moving. He was fascinated by the variety of people participating, young and old, white and black, radical and conservative. It seemed to Cornwall that the police were much more hostile to the peace demonstrators than they had been to the marchers from the Countryside Alliance, who had held their own march the week before. "Jane and I marched against the war last month," he wrote afterwards to his old friends John and Miranda Margetson, "and hope we'll get a chance to do it again before the world ends." In fact, they would do so only days later, joining a march to protest against a state visit by President Bush. They marched again the following February as part of a worldwide protest against plans to invade Iraq. Around 1 million people gathered in London for the demonstration, described as the largest protest in British history. When the march was brought to a halt in Whitehall, a huge roar rose from the packed crowd. Cornwall tried to imagine Tony Blair cowering in Downing Street, listening to the sound. In January 2003, Le Carré published an article in The Times on the ever louder drumbeat for war in America, entitled "The United States of America Has Gone Mad." By this time, war was imminent. Coalition armies were massing on the Iraqi border, and airstrikes against Iraqi military targets had begun. "America has entered one of its periods of historical madness, but this is the worst I can remember," Cornwall wrote. "Worse than McCarthyism, worse than the Bay of Pigs, and in the long term, potentially more disastrous than Vietnam." And now I'm quoting from him, "The reaction to 9/11 is beyond anything Osama bin Laden could ever have hoped for in his nastiest dreams. As in McCarthy times, the freedoms that have made America the envy of the world are being systematically eroded. The combination of compliant US media and vested corporate interests is once more ensuring that a debate that should be ringing out in every town square is confined to the loftier columns of the East Coast press. How Bush and his junta succeeded in deflecting America's anger from bin Laden to Saddam Hussein is one of the great public relations conjuring tricks of history. But they swung it. A recent poll tells us that 1 in 2 Americans now believe Saddam was responsible for the attack on the World Trade Center. But the American public is not merely being misled, it is being browbeaten and kept in a state of ignorance and fear. The invasion of Iraq, which began in March 2003, seemed to feed directly into Le Carré's writing. Several of the novel's reviewers would remark on an abrupt change of tone in Chapter 11, the chapter he was writing as the war began. In this chapter, Mundy is reborn as Cornwall's spokesman. Like Cornwall himself, Mundy marches in protest against the Iraq invasion with a conviction he never felt before, because convictions were essentially what he borrowed from other people. Suddenly he is mad as a hornet. The lies and hypocrisy of politicians are nothing new to him. They never were, so why now? Why leap on his soapbox and rant uselessly about the same things that have been going on since the first politician on earth lisped his first hypocrisy, lied, wrapped himself in the flag, put on God's armor, and said he never did it in the first place? It is the old man's impatience coming on early. It's anger at seeing the show come round again, one too many times. Cornwall modified his original plot to make it so that Mundy and Sasha, though innocent, are blackened as terrorists, and though unarmed, are gunned down by American special forces. Some reviewers would criticize this apocalyptic finale as implausible. In the run-up to the book's publication, a succession of journalists made the journey down to his home in West Cornwall — Cornwall lives in Cornwall — to interview him, most bringing a photographer who would invariably take a picture of a windswept Cornwall against a background of sea and cliff. One of these was the young novelist Lev Grossman, who interviewed him for Time magazine. His anger burns cold and clear, wrote Grossman. Absolute Friends is a work of fish-shaking, Orwellian outrage. Another of those visitors was the Scots writer and broadcaster James Naughtie, who interviewed Cornwall both for the Times and for the BBC Radio 4's Today programme. His anger is real, wrote Naughtie, to the extent that it is possible for a figure of his upbringing, bearing and voice, he rages. Cornwall reserved his bitterest bile for Tony Blair. To me, he told Naughtie in a radio interview, there's no bigger sin that a politician can commit than allowing his country to go to war under false pretenses. His fulminations against the Prime Minister enabled the Times to use the stand-first John le Carré, Blair must go, to advertise the interview on the front cover. The anger crackling in the novel dominated the British coverage. Few could fail to be thrilled by the unbridled rage that fuels his storytelling, wrote Robert McCrum in The Observer. If he was seething when he wrote The Constant Gardener, he is now incandescent. Most reviewers agreed with the view expressed by Stephen Ammidon in the Sunday Times, who wrote that Le Carré's anger comes across as a bit too raw to work as fiction, its rhetoric more in line with a Harold Pinter column than a Graham Greene novel. In a letter to an old friend, Cornwall dismissed the negative coverage as an onslaught from the right-wing press. One of the most thoughtful reviews came from Stephen Poole in The Guardian. He dismissed the criticism that the book's denouement was implausible. Anyone betting against the deviousness of unofficial American foreign policy over the last several decades would have lost countless shirts. But he found the novel's ending problematic, not because it is unlikely, but because it is overdetermined and gratuitous. Overdetermined because in the scheme of this novel there is no other villain in the modern world than America, and gratuitous because it is a deus ex machina that merely serves to illustrate the novel's politicized ranting. Given his enormous and undimmed skills as a storyteller, this could have been a brilliant book, but the sophisticated analysis of moral questions, of deceit, personal and political, and of shabby ends to justify honourable means that characterise his classic Cold War novels is here finally drowned out by strident editorializing, the monotonous expression of an anger imperfectly interrogated and so unhoned. Where once there was a subtle knife, here there is only a blunt stick. Absolute Friends was perceived as anti-American in the USA. Indeed, the British writer Geoffrey Wheatcroft used the book as a starting point for an article on the general topic of anti-Americanism in the New York Times. He referred to Le Carré as a writer who has enjoyed much success in America despite an aversion to American power dating from his earliest books, who has no very subtle political understanding, but who all too accurately voices the bitterness of national impotence and decline. One hazard of writing such overtly political novels was that Cornwall exposed himself to ridicule as a pundit. With a political statement this pungent, Le Carré knows he risks alienating his sizable American following, even of being written off as a crank, an aging, forgotten ex-spook, ranting at the world from his Cornish crag, suggested Lev Grossman. The New York Times gave the book to Michiko Kakutani, a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, notorious for her harsh reviews, and she did not disappoint. For her, Absolute Friends was a clumsy, hectoring, conspiracy-minded message novel meant to drive home the argument that American imperialism poses a grave danger to the New World Order. Since Absolute Friends, Le Carré's novels have continued this trend towards the didactic. It's possible to find some of his later novels a bit preachy without denying that they're classily assembled or failing to appreciate the leftish indignation behind them, wrote Christopher Taylor, an admiring critic of Le Carré's vintage period, reviewing Our Kind of Traitor, published in 2010, a book which dealt with the corrupting effect of Russian laundered money on British institutions. The theme of A Delicate Truth, published in 2013, is the outsourcing of intelligence requirements to commercial contractors, which Cornwell sees as part of a larger picture of the corporatization of Britain. In 2005, he had suggested that Britain might be sliding towards fascism. Mussolini's definition of fascism was that when you can't distinguish corporate power from governmental power, you are on your way to a fascist state. If you throw in God power and media power, that's where we are now, he told an interviewer from The Guardian. When asked if he was saying that Britain had become a fascist state, he replied, "Does it strike you as democratic?" The initiating incident of A Delicate Truth is a bungled abduction from Gibraltar of a suspected terrorist that leads to the killing of 2 blameless bystanders. The contractor responsible for this mess is a corporation called Ethical Outcomes, run by a Texan grotesque known as Miss Maisie, a tiny woman in a pink chiffon dress with matching hat and high-heeled shoes with diamante buckles. Small wonder that the reviewer in Publishers Weekly thought the book overly polemical. According to the anonymous reviewer, le Carré tells a great story in sterling prose, but he veers dangerously close to farce and caricature, particularly with the comically amoral Americans. His best work has been about the moral ambiguity of spying, while this novel feels as if the issue of who's bad and who's good is too neatly sewn up. In 2017, in a lecture to an audience at the Royal Festival Hall in London, broadcast live into cinemas across Britain, le Carré again warned of the dangers of a slide into fascism. Something seriously bad is happening, he stated. He spoke of his disdain for President Trump, whom he described as a demagogue, and described the effect of Trump's presidency on America and on the wider world as toxic. An earlier novel, A Most Wanted Man, published in 2008, had provided an extensive critique of the policy of extraordinary rendition. The book was inspired by the story of Murat Kurnaz, a Turkish citizen living in Germany who had been arrested on a visit to Pakistan and flown to the detention center at Guantanamo Bay in shackles, clad in a muzzle, opaque goggles, and sound-blocking ear muffs. During his 4.5 years in detention, he claimed to have been tortured by electric shocks, denied sleep for weeks on end, and kept for periods in solitary confinement. Once again, the American characters in the book are portrayed as unsympathetic zealots, their prisoners as guiltless victims. In an interview given to mark the book's publication, le Carré denied he was anti-American, just disgusted with what he called the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld disaster of the last 8 years. A Most Wanted Man was once again reviewed in the New York Times by Michiko Kakutani, and once again she wielded her stiletto. The novel is flawed, she wrote, like his 2004 book Absolute Friends, by an overly schematic narrative devised to drive home the author's contempt for the take-no-prisoners methods employed by the United States in the War on Terror. As a result, the moral chiaroscuro and the nuanced ambiguities that distinguish his Cold War novels give way in these pages to a blunter, more predictable storyline that lurches at times into sentimentality and contrivance. For that matter, Mr. le Carré's contempt for the United States post-9/11 approach to the War on Terror not only makes for a story told in blacks and whites, with none of the greys that distinguish his famous Smiley novels, but also results in an ending that the reader can see looming a mile off. This criticism strikes me as telling. Whatever one thinks about le Carré's politics, his increasingly strident tone drowns out the more subtle ambiguities that once graced his fiction. His moral outrage may be the fuel that keeps him writing, but getting steamed up blurs his vision. There is a tension between le Carré the activist and le Carré the novelist. Nothing he has written in the last 20 years is as interesting as the work of his vintage period, when George Smiley battled with his conscience in a conflict in which neither side was entirely right or entirely wrong. Thank you.
So now we move to our question period. We would ask that you wait to be called upon, and when you're called upon, if you would identify yourself and use the microphone that is handed to you. I'd like to start us off, if I may, by inquiring about what makes David Cornwell tick. And this wasn't something I was always clear about. And this has to do with his political trajectory. So he gets older, he becomes more radical. As the 21st century begins, he writes The Constant Gardener, Absolute Friends. His anti-Americanism and more strident tone are greater on display. in a quote that you offered here and is in the book as well, you write with chapter 11 and the shift in tone in the book that he was working on, like David himself, Mundy marches in protest against the Iraq invasion, with a quote, with a conviction he never felt before, because convictions were essentially what he borrowed from other people. And so I wonder, is this something you would apply to him for the earlier period? I don't get a clear read on his political passions, if there are any, in the earlier period. You make reference at one point that is with his sister, he's brought to a Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign event in the 80s. And one would imagine that if he wanted to vent his anti-Americanism, the Cold War in Latin America or Africa might be a servable topic for a novel, but he doesn't pursue that. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about his political convictions in a bit more depth before the 21st century, and what drove him, if anything at all.
Yes, well, it's a jolly difficult question to answer. I mean, as a young man, I don't think he was particularly political. I mean, his main motive was to do the right thing, and his father, I didn't explain this, and some of you will know this, his father had been a con man who'd served terms in prison, and whose contribution to the war against Hitler consisted of less than a week in uniform. And David was understandably ashamed. David, who'd been a schoolboy during the war, and whose fellow pupils' fathers had, many of them served in the forces, some of them had lost their lives, was understandably ashamed of his father's contribution. In fact, so ashamed that he pretended to his school friends that his father was a secret agent who'd been parachuted undercover into Germany. Of course, no such thing had occurred. He was busy selling dried fruit and nylons. But I think le Carré's, David's early motive was all patriotic, really. He wanted to do the right thing for his country and to a larger extent, perhaps, for freedom. He's not really left-wing in the sense of he doesn't really have a coherent ideology. He's certainly not a Marxist. He believes strongly in injustice, and he dislikes bullying, and he dislikes big power interference with small power, and so on. And I suppose the anti-Americanism comes out because America is the most powerful country in the world, but he equally dislikes, on a much lesser level, or lower level, if you like, British bullying and indeed Russian bullying. I mean, the plot of our game is all about Russian suppression of minorities in the Caucasus. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a bit of knee-jerk anti-Americanism, as I tried to indicate, that was sort of endemic in English culture, which springs from a resentment of the dramatic loss of British power after the Second World War, which was concealed from the British public to some extent by the fact that, you know, we won. That was sort of the narrative. And we were surprised to find that the big three no longer rule the world. And I think that that was particularly so in people of his generation. And there was a strong feeling like that, I think, too, within the intelligence services, when those people who had fought in the war and who did a lot of daring do, and indeed had been the senior partners to the OSS in many theatres, suddenly found themselves the junior partners. And there was definitely a kind of cultural lag there. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that his politics go much deeper than that. I think it's really quite basic. And I mean, at the heart of his best books, it's all about human relations.
Thank you.
Could I perhaps follow up by just asking a little bit, for those of us who haven't had a chance to read your book, to talk a little bit about your sources. The latter part of your presentation was based a lot on reviews, but I imagine there were other sources you've tapped into, from interviews to papers, and I just, you know, if you could sort of
yes,
elaborate
certainly.
a little bit.
Yes. Well, I mean, I had unprecedented access to le Carré himself, and he has often said that I've interviewed him much longer than anybody else ever. I probably spent about 60 hours with him. But actually, I found that less useful than you'd imagine. Often he was telling me stories I already knew, and I knew were slightly exaggerated or distorted. Much more useful was access to his archive. And I well remember the time when I first saw his archive, which is in an old outhouse and the house in Cornwall, a converted garage, boxes and boxes of unsorted documents and filing cabinets, old dusty filing cabinets. And no one has really systematically gone through them. Various sort of assistants and secretaries at various times have tried to rationalize these. Anyway, I was shown this by le Carré's wife when I arrived one April morning, and it was such a lovely day that I left the door open because I could hear the birds singing and the insects in the air, and the spring was in the air, and it just there on the Cornish cliff top felt idyllic. And then there was a shadow against the door, and there was David with his spectacles on the end of his nose. And he said to me, "It's so strange to have you here, Adam, poking about inside my mind." So maybe that's what I was doing. But yeah, I think the archives are by far the most important. There's also an archive at the Bodleian Library of his manuscripts, and it's very interesting to see the development of his he rewrites and rewrites and rewrites. I mean, for example, I did a little exercise on the opening pages of The Night Manager, and I found at least 19 different versions. And a lot of the books are completely different when they're finished from how he envisages them at the start.
Thank you. All right, floor is open for your comments and questions. If you can please identify yourself and let us know so the microphone can make its way to you. Yeah, Ross, we'll start up.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Can you interpret how did he become a writer of fiction? How, in his being an officer of MI5 and then MI6, what took him to be a writer of fiction even way back then when he was in government service?
Well, it seemed actually that pretty much every one of his colleagues was writing a book, as far as I can see. The chap who shared an office with him, on whom he partially based the character, George Smiley, was an established writer of spy whodunits. So was the chap who did his first training course at MI6. Of course, Graham Greene had been in intelligence, and was the most famous example. But there were lots and lots of lesser-known people. So. It was in the water, so to speak. But actually, at the beginning, when he was newly married, he didn't think about becoming a writer. He thought about being a commercial artist, and his wife was the one who planned to be a writer. And it was really in going through her manuscripts, which weren't very good, I'm afraid, and thinking I can do this better, that he sort of began to think of himself as a writer.
Thank you. Yeah, Dane.
Yes, Dane Kennedy, National History Center. Your first two biographies were of historians, and now you have written this one about a novelist. I'm just curious about your experience. Obviously, you also wrote about Boswell, so there's
also about Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Okay, excuse me. Well, could you speak about? Are you struck more by the similarities or the differences writing biographies of historians versus fiction writers?
There's more. He has more in common with Hugh Trevor-Roper, for example, than you might think. Hugh Trevor-Roper served in MI6 during the war, and Hugh Trevor-Roper knew Kim Philby very well. And indeed, there was he and Trevor-Roper clashed over Kim Philby. So there is an overlap. Of course, historians of that generation perhaps got their hands more dirty than historians do now. I don't know,
we can't tell you.
You can't. Yeah, fair enough. But you know. What links? I know I've darted around in a ridiculous way, but what links all these people, I think, is that they're all writers, and that's what really interests me is writing. I think one of the things I tried to say today about Cornwall's increasing partisanship is, you can think what you like. You may agree with him or disagree with him, but it hasn't influenced his work for the better. It's the opposite. And I just wish he'd stop writing now, because he's written some wonderful books, and they get worse and worse.
I'm Michael Bishop from the National Churchill Library and Centre. And I've read and enjoyed your Taylor and Trevor-Roper and Cornwell biographies very much. I wonder which of the three you find most personally sympathetic, and how much that matters as a biographer, or how much easier it might make the task.
Do you know, I think that what happens with a biographer is that you stop really thinking about whether you like or don't like them. There's got to be some way in which, at the beginning, that you feel sympathy for them. I couldn't write a book about someone I found fundamentally antipathetic, but they soon begin to seem like a member of your own family. You don't decide whether you personally like your parents, for example. They're just your parents. Perhaps that's an embarrassingly Freudian comparison, I don't know. And the other thing is that when you're writing the book, that person seems to you to be terribly important. I always get teased by my family, and my children in particular, about whatever subject I'm writing about, because everything seems to be related to that person. So, the thing I always remember is when I was working on Trevor-Roper, who had very bad sinus difficulties, so bad that even in 1940, when he was doing very important decoding work, breaking German codes, he had to have a major sinus operation. I noticed that my sinuses got much worse, really bad. I had a lot of trouble, took all sorts of different kind of remedies and things. And when I finished the book, they got better again.
Yeah.
Well, I was very interested to see you talk on Sisman the other day.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Phillip Collier. I'm a freelance journalist, although most people have told me that I should write much more, but I waste too much time playing in international chess tournaments. But about le Carré, one particular thing about him, I read an interview with him several years ago, and he was talking about a book he wrote called The Looking Glass War. And he said about that book, when it was published, people said it wasn't as exciting as A Spy Who Came from the Cold. And his answer was, he said that he'd had a huge success with The Spy Who Came from the Cold, which made his earlier books more, people started going back to read them. In The Looking Glass War, he was trying to present as realistic picture as possible of what it was like to be in intelligence work during the height of the Cold War. And he said that's what he was trying to do, and a lot of that is boring. And so that's what he was in the book. And he said that after he wrote the book, there were reviewers who talked about it not being exciting, but he got a lot of letters from former intelligence officers who said, you really explained what it's like. Now, the other thing about the anti-Americanism and all that, well, one of the things that occurs to me, my family's English, but my father worked for United Stations Special Branch, and I went back and forth. I went to school both here and in England. Now, one of the things you get studying American history from the Spanish-American wars being fought today, every single one of them is hugely controversial in the United States. I could point to libraries of American intellectual people who've written books against every single foreign policy decision the U.S. has ever made. So people abroad think of the U.S. as all one thing, but if you live in America, you discover that one of these decisions are hugely controversial. And even if le Carré was against everything America did in the last 50 years or so, he'd find a lot of Americans who would support him. A lot more will support him. I mean, if the U.S. gets into a big war in the Middle East, there'll be a lot more anti-Americanism, and that's another story.
Well, of course, I agree with you, and any balanced person thinks the same. And just as in my country, a lot of people were against the Iraq War, though it became British government policy. My parents, actually, who were far from being political activists and were already in their 80s, marched against the Iraq War. I always remember that they were being fellows of the Royal Academy. They were able to nip in and use the facilities during the march. No, I think, of course, I agree with you about that. Going back to the Looking Glass War, it was widely perceived to be a disappointment after The Spy Who Came from the Cold. It's easy to forget what a huge thing The Spy Who Came in from the Cold was. It was number one on the US bestseller list for 35 weeks. That's amazing, and it completely transformed his life. It was the best-selling novel in America of that year. I mean, it was just a gigantic thing, and also had an enormous cultural impact, so that people used the phrase "came in from the cold" all the time, even now. It's just entered the language. So any follow-up was likely to be a disappointment. But in fact, it is also a very bleak novel. It represents a very bleak time in his personal life, as you'll find if you read my book. I mean, his marriage was falling apart, and he was disgusted with himself and almost suicidal. And it's a depiction, particularly, of the old SOE people who were living on past glories from wartime, and they hadn't adjusted to the modern world. And they appeared increasingly laughable and incompetent. It's rather bitter, but it's a good book in its own way.
A former Smithsonian Fellow. I touched on this topic of Le Carré's anti-Americanism in a book about 15 years ago.
Oh, did you? You're ahead of me.
And his solicitors immediately threatened to sue Little Brown and Company. He was extremely sensitive about this issue, and my question, therefore, is whether you yourself have gotten any pushback or resistance from him, let alone his solicitors, on this topic.
Well, that's very interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. He is very touchy. I mean, in my case, I like to describe myself as being like a kind of old-fashioned harpoonist. I've got my harpoon into Leviathan. I'm being towed along, but I have got it firmly in. And I mean, we came to an agreement that he couldn't, although he would be the first person to read the book, he couldn't control what I wrote. And so I think he is, well, I know he is quite grumpy, as what his oldest son described to me about my book, but that's it. Actually, when I sent him the manuscript, after only a few days, I received back from him a 20-something page email with 240 numbered points. But that actually most of the points were quite good ones. So, it is difficult to write a biography of a living person, and he is very sensitive, as you've discovered. But no, I mean, he didn't try and stop me writing what I wrote.
David Smith of The Guardian. So thanks for your multiple references to The Guardian. I just wonder, do you get a sense of what he made of the election of Barack Obama, given all his criticisms of the Bush administration and so on? Did that suddenly sort of change his attitude, and was that something he sort of embraced, and did you sort of buy into the notion this is a whole new era, or was it just a blip?
I don't actually recall any specific mentions of Obama, but he went on being very critical of the Guantanamo Bay detention center and the rendition and his novel. Well, I'm just trying to remember. Obama was elected in 2008, wasn't he? Yeah. Wasn't? Yes. So the novel that deals with that, I suppose, came out in 2008. No, he really hated Bush. I mean, there are little kind of jokey kind of frame things about Bush around on the walls in his house, and goodness knows what he thinks of Trump. I mean, as you know as well as I do, we in Britain all rather liked Obama and thought and were impressed by him, and not so impressed by his successor. So I can't really answer your question.
My name is Dick Art. I was a cultural attaché and a historian of cultural diplomacy, which is a third angle of espionage, ordinary warfare and a different kind of warfare. But I happened to be in Beirut at the same time as Kim Philby was when he disappeared. And so I got to know him and Eleanor. relatively well, considering what a cultural attaché would discuss with a person like him, Philby. But it's a fascinating experience to see someone who comes essentially from a literary background touching on this espionage question, because it's a whole different way of looking at the world. You're all connecting dots, after all, little bits of information that you have to fit together in very ingenious ways. It's what novelists do. It's also what the intelligent people do. So you've opened, to my way of thinking, a whole new chapter in what I'm working on right now.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
I very much enjoyed your book and reviewed it earlier this year, so it's great to hear you in person. Your book touched on his initial semi-favorable reactions to Margaret Thatcher, which I guess later turned much more negative, but could you elaborate on that at all?
Actually, I don't remember any favourable reaction, though he was invited to go, and he did go and have lunch with Mrs. Thatcher, I think on at least one, possibly two occasions. No, I mean, he politically, he says he's always voted Labour until recently, and then he was so disgusted with Tony Blair that, I mean, even when he was in his apolitical youth, more recently he voted Liberal Democrat. He does a very good imitation of Mrs. Thatcher. One of the things about him is he's a brilliant mimic, and actually it's rather. I'm rather fascinated by the way he's very good at, as any of you who enjoy his novels know, at dialogue. And one of the ways he constructs dialogue is through mimicry. He walks along the coastal footpath with a little notepad like this, and he's mumbling to himself, acting out parts, and often in accents. It might be a German accent, it might be a Russian accent, it might be an American accent. And people who live nearby know that if they encounter him in this and hear him doing this, not to greet him or indeed interrupt him in any ways. And when he's got a sentence right, he's polished it enough in his mind, he stops and scribbles it down, and then these scribbled notes get taken back, and his wife has to type them out, and then they later get sort of stapled. I mean, it's a very low-tech system together and retyped. But so sort of mimicry is part of his way of writing. Sorry, I moved away from Mrs. Thatcher a bit, but it inspired me to think of it.
Question. Did you ever get the feeling or sense that some of his political fulminations were something of an affectation? I mean, I've read a great deal about him, and I've read many, many interviews in which he discusses the fact that he never does interviews, or watched public appearances in which he talks about...
This is my last interview. He's always saying that.
Yeah, he has more last interviews than anyone I've ever heard of. So I wonder, sometimes I just wonder if it's a little bit exaggerated or put on, or maybe projected backwards, because
I think
is
that,
more
like a lot of very famous people, he's slightly lost a grip on reality. He is a bit paranoid. He believes that he's being bugged all the time, and he believes that other people are talking about him when they're not. I think he genuinely believes that it's important for him to write these books because he's got a message to convey to the public. Perhaps he has, but it seems to me to be a dangerous road to go down. And so he's writing not so much now because he thinks that he's got a satisfying novel, but because he's got a message. And so I don't think it's an affectation. No, I think he really does believe that. It's increasingly, no one dares criticize him. That's another thing. Another thing that happens with famous writers is that fewer and fewer people dare criticize them. If an editor criticizes one of their manuscripts, the editor is replaced, and so they live more and more in a world of their own, surrounded by mirrors rather than like the rest of us, kind of jostling. So I'm afraid I think that I think he is he's not acting. He believes it all.
I'm going to guess that your editor was content when you concluded on page 600, but it doesn't take us up to the present because it can't. And since your book comes out, yet another novel, right, appears, A Legacy of Spies. And so for the paperback edition, imagine that you negotiate, maybe you have, a few extra pages in which you bring the book forward a couple of years in time. This is a book in which le Carré revisits an earlier classic with various characters that have become familiar. Could you talk about what you might say about that book? I mean, it does feel, if not like closure, then something close to it.
Well, actually, the paperback is out in both the US and the UK. But I am thinking about producing a revised edition after his death, because there's a lot of things I wasn't able to say, which I would like to say, not just about what's happened in the last few years, but much further back. I mean, obviously, about his personal life. There's a lot I know about his personal life, which, you know, it didn't seem right to go into for one reason or another while he and his wife are alive.
Oh my.
But not just tittle-tattle, but other things that I knew would upset him too much. I mean, I hope that I haven't distorted the story by leaving these things out, but I would like to tell the full story in due course. As for the most recent novel, well, I'm afraid I think it reads like a parody of le Carré, like someone, you know, not a very good parody at that. I just wish he hadn't written it. But I mean, you know, everyone can have their own opinion. I know some other people really like it, and he has touches of the moments of the old mastery, but nothing like the subtlety. And as I keep on saying, I know I'm repeating myself, but this kind of messianic quality, this, you know, manifest in anti-Americanism, but also in his kind of his belief that everything's wrong in the modern world and that he knows best, it's tiring, it's tedious to read, really. Even if you agree with some of the points, it's tedious to read. You know, I happen to agree myself with some of his criticisms of the modern world, but not all of them by any means. I think the Iraq War was a terrible mistake. You know, you don't go to a novelist to be preached at least I don't. He's got too preachy for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I attended the panel that you and David Ignatius and Joseph Cannon were at the National Book Festival, which what I thought was quite interesting, and had as its sort of overarching theme the way in which le Carré has been sort of the shaping influence in thinking about modern espionage, right? Not just in fiction, but perhaps in the way we imagine it in fact. As I recall, he has written one novel that has attempted to address the way in which the impact of digital influences have reshaped espionage. But could you offer any reflections generally about whether we're sort of at a rupture point in the way in which we think about espionage and the way in which espionage works?
I will say that I don't think David really understands the digital world, and his kind of references to anything to do with computers or mobile phones or anything like that, they're obviously kind of mugged up from Wikipedia or, you know, borrowed. His son has helped him out. I mean, he doesn't do any of these things himself. He's not really in touch in that way. I think, but I think there's a different point, which and a point that actually a sort of a senior MI6 officer made to me, which is that le Carré has become, as Ian Fleming also became, a manifestation of British soft power. That he said whenever an MI6 officer goes in the world, everyone's heard of George Smiley and James Bond. You know, it's a calling card. And they think that we're better at it than than we really are, because George Smiley is a master spy. They think that's a portrayal of reality. In a strange way, fiction has become truth, and that's quite curious.
All right. Well, last two questions then.
John Garrity, retired government. What political figures or writers does Le Carré admire?
I'm not sure he really admires any politicians. I can't think of any off the top of my head. He admires other writers. I mean, it's partly because of his sensibility. I mean, he's really about the individual, the conscience, moral dilemmas. I mean, those. Although all this preachy stuff that I've been talking about has sort of become has overlain all that in recent years. You know, if you scratch deep, that's really it's really about people. And so politics is not really his thing, which is why his politics are often so naive. He's interested in Dickens and Balzac, and these are the people who he really admires. He would love to be thought of as the modern Dickens, and of course he isn't quite, but even the comparison is, something, isn't it?
Final question.
Christopher Gray. I would just like to ask, did Le Carré ever get to meet Marcus Wolf, a.k.a. Carla, or some of Carla's leading subordinates? And did Marcus Wolf and the Stasi intelligence officers hold Le Carré in high esteem?
He had certainly met several senior KGB people after the fall of communism. Indeed, he likes to quote the former head of the KGB as, who, when asked, "Who do you look up to?" he said, "George Smiley, of course." But I don't know whether he met Marcus Wolf or not. I expect it's on the record somewhere. I just don't know. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Just any member of the Stasi. I meant the KGB as well.
Yes.
You've answered the question.
Oh, he recently found, by the way, that he has a Stasi file. And there's not really much very interesting on him, but there's a lot of stuff about his father. The Stasi obviously thought his father was quite a serious person, instead of the ridiculous bluffer that he was. And they actually burgled his office and made a careful diagram of his office that's in the files. Yeah, it just shows how ridiculous, how incompetent the Stasi were, as well as it's not just us.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to bring this session to a conclusion. Let me remind everyone that next Tuesday, September 11th, we'll have with us Adam Tooze on Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. Was fortunate to hear Adam Tooze in Berlin this spring. It's a phenomenal presentation. I hope many of you can join us for that. Let me invite you to a small reception in the next room over. Some nibbles, some wine to continue the conversation more formally, but not without thanking our speaker. And Sisman, thank you so much for a very rich lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that's cool.
I welcome the chance to read the book in preparation for this. I have to say...
600 pages, I know.
No. I was going to say, I actually liked The Legacy of Spies, I think a little bit better than you did.
Yeah, well,
which I read in preparation for this as well.
It's a free country, or at least I think it is still.
But now I dug out...
I think it is.